If you've not heard, the Fantastic Four, also known as the world's greatest comic magazine, also known as the first family of superheroes, is almost definitely coming back to Marvel's Cinematic Universe, or MCU for short. So why say almost definitely? Well, because despite some of the early talk about the deal with Disney and Fox, Fox does not actually own the production rights to the Fantastic Four. A smaller German company called Constantin Films actually owns those rights. Fox just owns the distribution rights to the Fantastic Four. What does this mean in the long run? Well, more than likely nothing. Constantin has allowed Fox to produce all the prior Fantastic Four films, and if you look at the filmography of Constantin, it would seem that honestly doing a big budget superhero film is not something that they would be capable of, which of course is why they partnered with Fox in the first place. Now, all that with Constantin aside, based on recent statements from Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, it seems fairly clear that Disney intends on adding the Fantastic Four to the MCU lineup, which of course is great news. Marvel has a great track record of making really fun, entertaining films that are true to the original source material while still being something new. But this may be a tougher challenge for the Fantastic Four. I've heard a lot of people speculate on how it should be done. I think some of the ideas have been great and others, not so much. But I'm going to build upon some of the stuff that I've heard and really look at how the first family of superheroes should be introduced in the MCU. So let me start by saying that there have been various concepts of how to introduce the Fantastic Four all over the internet. So if elements of what I'm saying sounds familiar, it may be because I'm taking ideas from some of the things that you looked at in the past. So if you're thinking, hey, Movie Bob suggested that, or hey, I heard Geek Council say that, you may be right. I'm not claiming to have thought of every part of this myself. As far as the introduction, I would start the film in very much the same vein as the first Iron Man film. In that film, we get about 4 minutes showing Tony Stark's abduction by the Ten Rings. For this film, I would do something very similar, but incorporating elements from the classic Fantastic Four origin. While this will ultimately be a time travel story, as many have suggested, I will not start the film in 1961. Rather, we see an establishing shot over Earth with a simple title card reading Earth, present day. Then into the frame, we see a rocket ship spinning out of control as it begins to enter the atmosphere. We cut to the interior of the ship and the four occupants are struggling to control the ship. In kind of a frame-by-frame copy of what we have from Fantastic Four #1, we see the ship crash in the countryside, the four occupants come out and mutate before our eyes into Mr. Fantastic, the Invisible Girl, the Human Torch, and the Thing. They put their hands together, vowing to stick together and to use their abilities for the betterment of mankind, and then we fade to the Marvel logo. Now, after the Marvel logo, we have an establishing shot of New York with the title card, New York, 1961. To make Fantastic Four work as a film, you have to understand what the Fantastic Four is about. And considering that I've already referred to them several times as the first family of superheroes, you should be able to muster a guess that they are about family. So we're going to spend about the next 10 minutes of the film introducing the four main characters and their relationships with each other. Reed Richards, the brilliant scientist, Sue Storm, his fiancée and scientific partner, Johnny Storm, Sue's younger brother, a gifted engineer and mechanic, and Ben Grimm, Reed's best friend and military test pilot. The four of them are working on a top-secret government-funded project, a rocket capable of not only entering space but at traveling speeds nearing the speed of light thanks to Reed's gravity well engine. As we are getting to know the quartet, we find that funding for the project has been cut as the government is having to divert more military funding to the escalating conflict in Vietnam. Reed, Sue, Ben, and Johnny are arguing over how to proceed. Reed, Sue, and Johnny are all convinced that they should launch the rocket and prove the gravity well engine is viable, but Ben is reluctant, suggesting that they should follow orders and abandon the project rather than the risk of flying an untested ship. Sue manages to convince Ben to do it, and they sneak onto the launch pad under the cover of night, just like we see in the comics. After a perfect launch, they find themselves in orbit. They engage the gravity well drive, the ship begins accelerating, but there's a problem. The ship's nuclear reactor seems to be overloading. The ship begins accelerating wildly, much faster than they had anticipated. Reed tells Ben to try and maneuver the ship, keeping it in a high orbit above Earth, avoiding being flung out into deep space. Meanwhile, having Johnny attempting to shut down the reactor, Reed and Sue try to work out the calculations of how to slow the ship down once they get the engine offline. After about a minute, Johnny manages to get the reactor offline and the gravity well shuts down. The ship is still traveling way too fast to re-enter the atmosphere, however, so Sue calculates an angle of approach and burn time to slow the ship enough to possibly survive re-entry. The plan works. Barely. We then, again, this is a similar approach to how they did it in the original Iron Man film. We see an abbreviated version of the crash scene that we saw at the beginning of the film. The four mutate, they decide to use their abilities for good, and then they turn in shock and see something unlike anything they've ever seen before. 21st century Earth. Some modern military would pick them up, and after verifying they are indeed who they claim to be, Reed and Sue figure out that they went much faster and longer than they had planned, and the relativistic time dilation effect pushed them forward in time over 50 years. And by the way, that is not technobabble. That could actually happen. If you know anything about relativistic physics, the faster a body is in motion, the slower it perceives time. So if you're moving fast enough, a 5-minute trip could take 50 years of Earth time. From there, you could take the story in about 1 million different directions, depending on what you want to do. I would try to avoid using Dr. Doom until the second or third film. In fact, I think Dr. Doom would be an excellent master villain to build up to a cinematic, climactic Avengers, Fantastic Four, X-Men arc. I would more realistically tone it down a bit for this and use something like the Mole Man from Fantastic Four #1. Now, I know that a lot of people think the Mole Man is silly, but this is a Marvel film, and commonly in Marvel films, the bad guy is simply an excuse for the heroes to use their powers in combat, and that is the only reason we need the Mole Man. So the Fantastic Four figure out, that they're stuck there. We establish the basic stuff like their headquarters at the Baxter Building. They defeat the Mole Man, roll credits. Now that's just a basic outline. What I really want to touch on next is what they need to avoid. One thing I want to make clear is that the driving force behind the film needs to be Reed, Sue, Ben, and Johnny's family dynamic. That is the core of the Fantastic Four. Reed should be at least 40 years old, Sue and Ben in their mid to late 30s, Johnny in his 20s. Reed should be the patriarch of the family, despite the fact that patriarch is a dirty word these days. In both the Tim Story films and the Josh Trank film, they purposely casted Reed young. I assume this is to appeal to more of a younger audience. However, this fundamentally shifts the relationship of Reed on the team from a father figure to a friend. Reed Richards is supposed to be the single smartest person of all of Marvel. He is the person that everyone else goes to when they need something figured out. While having a young genius can work in film, in Reed's case, this would break his character. Now, a lot of people suggested adding a progressive political spin to the film. I truly hope that this does not happen. What a lot of people have suggested is that using the 21st century as a backdrop for the Fantastic Four to learn about how backwards and terrible their antiquated family values of the 60s are. Sue should immediately become liberated. Johnny and Ben could realize that just because Reed is older doesn't mean he knows what's best, and Reed would have to deal with his privilege and realize how wrong he's been all of his life. That, I think, would be a horrible mistake. First, I would hate to see the MCU start down the dark political path that franchises like Star Trek and Star Wars have gone in recent days. Captain America is not a great character in the MCU because he suddenly realized that his 1940s black and white good and evil way of thinking is wrong. He's a great character because he can see evil for evil in the 21st century when others around him shrug it off as just being the new normal. Steve Rogers is a good man to the core. When he's put into a world where being a good man to the core is out of style, he holds on to the ideas, and that's what makes him a hero. Reed, Sue, Ben, and Johnny can equally display the power of a strong family bond. Just because strong families are no longer in style does not change the fact that their relationships are what give them their strength. Interestingly enough, even though Captain America did in fact start out as a propaganda piece supporting World War II, and his films have had the most politics in them of all the Marvel Universe films, unlike Star Wars, nobody's complaining about it. Is this because Cap is more conservative and the spin is to the right? Honestly, I don't think that's the reason. I think that the reason that people don't complain about the politics of the Captain America films is simply that they flow naturally from the story and the characters and the plot, as opposed to Star Wars, where the story, the characters, and the plot are simply there to serve the political agenda. In the end, if done right, the Fantastic Four could go from being the world's greatest comic magazine to the world's greatest superhero film franchise. Or we could get more crap like what Fox gave us 3 times. Good luck, Marvel.